Eleanor Whitmore did not beg. She had buried her husband with her bare hands, survived 2 winters alone, and walked 14 miles in worn-out boots just to stand at this man's door. And when Nathan Caldwell looked her up and down, took in her size, her plain dress, her old suitcase, and said, "I don't think this is the right fit, ma'am," she did not cry. She looked him straight in the eye and said, "You haven't seen what I can do yet, Mr. Caldwell." He should have listened. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and follow along until the very end, because what Eleanor discovers inside that ranch will change everything. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Eleanor Whitmore arrived at Silver Creek Ranch, the Kansas wind was cutting hard across the open plain, the kind of cold that got into your bones and reminded you that the land out here didn't care about your troubles. She had been on the road since before sunrise. Her boots had a crack along the left sole that let the damp in, and her coat was too thin for late October. But she kept walking because stopping wasn't something she allowed herself to do anymore. Not since James died. Not since the relatives came and took what little he'd left behind. Not since the last hotel in Dodge City told her they were sorry, but they needed someone more suitable for the position. More suitable. She had learned what that meant. It meant younger. It meant smaller. It meant someone who didn't remind the guests that real life was hard and heavy and unbeautiful. Eleanor was 38 years old, wide across the shoulders and full in the body, with hands that were rough from years of real work and a face that had seen enough grief to make most people look away. She wasn't the kind of woman who stopped traffic on a Sunday afternoon. She knew that. She had known it most of her life, and she had made her peace with it long ago, back when she understood that the world was going to treat her a certain way, and the only question was whether she was going to let that stop her or not. She had decided it was not going to stop her. So she walked. She had the letter in her coat pocket, folded 3 times, the edges worn soft from how many times she'd opened and closed it over the last 2 weeks. It was a small advertisement, clipped from a Wichita paper by a woman at the boarding house who said she thought Eleanor might be interested. Cook needed. Silver Creek Ranch. Must be experienced. Apply in person. That was all it said. She had applied in writing first, laid out her experience, her years at the Granger Hotel kitchen, her ability to manage supply orders and keep costs down, her record of feeding 30 men 3 times a day without a single complaint about quality. She had written it carefully, honestly, without exaggeration, because she believed that the truth was always worth more than performance. She had not received a written response, but she had received word through the boarding house woman, whose cousin's husband worked a neighboring spread, that Silver Creek was still looking. So Eleanor packed her 1 suitcase, pinned her best brooch to her coat, and came anyway. The ranch was larger than she expected. She could see it from the road. A solid spread of land, well fenced, the main house big and practical looking, barns in good repair, a bunkhouse set back from the house at a respectful distance. Someone had built this place with serious intention. Someone had worked hard here. She respected that before she even reached the gate. A young ranch hand with a sunburned face and straw-colored hair was repairing a section of fence near the road. He stopped when he saw her coming and pulled off his hat. "Afternoon, ma'am. Can I help you find somebody?" "I'm looking for Mr. Nathan Caldwell," Eleanor said. "I've come about the cook position." The young man, she would learn later his name was Thomas Reed, looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he nodded and pointed her toward the main house. "He's out back with the horses right now, ma'am. I can take you around, or you can go through the front door and wait in the hall." "I'll go through the front," Eleanor said. "Thank you kindly." She walked up the path toward the house, her suitcase in her right hand, her chin level, her breathing steady. She had learned a long time ago that how you walked into a room said something before you ever opened your mouth. She intended to walk in like a woman who had every right to be there. Because she did. She knocked twice, firm and clear. No one answered. She knocked again. After another minute, she heard heavy boots on a wooden floor, and then the door opened, and Nathan Caldwell was standing in front of her. He was a big man, built wide and square across the chest, with dark hair gone mostly silver at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same Kansas limestone as everything else out here. He was wearing work clothes, dusty from a morning outdoors, and he had the look of a man who had not slept well in several nights. Deep lines around his eyes, a tightness in his mouth. He looked at her. She watched his eyes move, from her face, to her body, to the suitcase in her hand, back to her face, and she saw the exact moment he made up his mind. It took less than 4 seconds. "Can I help you?" he said. Not unkindly, but not warmly either. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm Eleanor Whitmore. I've come about the cook position. I wrote you a letter several weeks ago. I have experience running a hotel kitchen, managing supply orders, and feeding large numbers of working men. I'm hardworking, honest, and I don't waste food or money." He looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said slowly, "I appreciate you making the trip out here. I do. But I think there may have been some miscommunication somewhere along the line. The position I'm looking to fill requires someone who can handle a full ranch kitchen. Early mornings, late nights, heavy lifting, managing a full supply schedule. It's not a light job." "I understand that," Eleanor said. "I just don't think—" He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. "I think you'd find it too demanding is all." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Too demanding," she repeated, not as a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Mr. Caldwell," she said, keeping her voice even, "I have been running kitchens since I was 19 years old. I ran the kitchen at the Granger Hotel in Wichita for 11 years. I cooked 3 meals a day for up to 40 guests, managed a full supply budget, trained junior staff, and never once missed a service. I did all of that while nursing a sick husband in his final year and managing our household finances on my own. I came 14 miles this morning on foot to stand at your door. I don't believe you've correctly assessed what I can handle." Nathan Caldwell stared at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite respect, not yet, but something that recognized she had not flinched. And then Samuel Briggs appeared. He came around the corner of the house from the direction of the barns, moving with the easy confidence of a man who knew his place on this property and liked it very much. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, lean and well put together, with a wide smile that he turned on Eleanor immediately. "Well now," Briggs said pleasantly, stopping beside Nathan. "Who's this?" "Mrs. Whitmore," Nathan said. "She's come about the cook position." Briggs looked Eleanor over with the kind of smile that was polite on the surface and something else entirely underneath. "Is that right?" he said. "Bless your heart for coming all this way, ma'am. We did put that notice out a while back, didn't we, Nathan? But I think we've got someone lined up now, don't we?" "We haven't hired anyone yet," Nathan said. Briggs laughed softly. "Well, not officially, but between you and me, Mrs. Whitmore, a working ranch kitchen is a rough place. Not really suited to every person. A lot of these ranchers end up bringing in younger gals who can really move fast, keep up with the pace. You understand?" Eleanor looked at him. She understood exactly what he was saying. How was saying she was too old, too large, too worn to be worth the trouble. He was saying it with a smile and a folksy tone so it couldn't be called rude, but he was saying it clearly enough. She turned back to Nathan. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a fair trial. Give me 1 week. I'll cook for your hands, manage your supply schedule, and show you my methods. If at the end of that week you don't believe I'm the right person for this position, I'll leave without argument, and I won't trouble you again. But I'm asking you to give me the chance to show you what I'm worth before you decide you already know." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Briggs. Briggs gave a small shrug with an expression that said, "Your call, but I've made my opinion clear." And then Nathan Caldwell said, "1 week, Mrs. Whitmore, starting tomorrow morning." Samuel Briggs stopped smiling. It was just for half a second, quick enough that most people would have missed it. But Eleanor was watching. She had been watching people her whole life, and she noticed the things that happened in the space between expressions. She noticed that. She filed it away. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "You won't regret it." She picked up her suitcase and walked inside. The kitchen was the first room she asked to see, and Thomas Reed, the young straw-haired hand from the fence, walked her there himself, quiet and polite, stealing glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking. "You really walked 14 miles?" he asked finally, when they reached the kitchen door. 13 and a half, Eleanor said. "The last half-mile I hitched a ride with a man hauling hay." Thomas Reed laughed. It was a surprised, genuine sound, and Eleanor liked him immediately for it. The kitchen was a disaster. Not a dirty disaster. Someone had been making attempts at cleaning, she could see that. But it was the kind of disorder that came from no system, no organization, no real understanding of how a working kitchen needed to operate. Supplies were stacked without logic. Dry goods were stored near a moisture-prone wall. There was flour in a container that hadn't been properly sealed, and she could see from across the room that it had already started to turn. She set her suitcase down and walked the length of the room slowly, opening cupboards, checking labels, running a finger along a shelf, and looking at what came away on her fingertip. Thomas stood in the doorway watching her. "It's not great," he offered. "It's manageable," Eleanor said. "Who's been cooking?" "Different hands taking turns mostly. Briggs hired a woman from town about 6 months back, but she left after 3 weeks. Before that, it was a fella named Pete who burned everything he touched." He paused. "No offense to Pete." "None taken on Pete's behalf," Eleanor said. She had pulled out a small notebook from her coat pocket and was already making notes. Inventory. What was there? What was missing? What needed to be thrown out and replaced? She moved through the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had done this in unfamiliar kitchens before and knew how to read a space quickly. And then she found the supply ledger. It was sitting on a shelf near the back door, partially hidden behind a stack of mismatched tin plates. A plain ledger book, worn at the corners, filled with columns of figures in careful, neat handwriting. She picked it up. She wasn't trying to snoop. She was trying to understand what had been ordered, what was actually present, and where the gaps were. A standard process for any cook taking over a kitchen. She expected to find normal accounting. Deliveries made and received, costs noted, the ordinary record of a working ranch's food supply. What she found was something else entirely. She stood there for a long moment, looking at the numbers. The quantities recorded in the ledger did not match what was actually in the kitchen. Not even close. Somewhere in the gap between what the ledger said had been received and what was actually sitting on these shelves, there was enough missing food and supply money to make Eleanor's stomach go tight. This wasn't disorganization. This wasn't waste. This was a pattern. She looked up. Thomas Reed was still in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching the last of the afternoon light come through the window. Eleanor closed the ledger carefully and set it back exactly where she'd found it. She said nothing. But her mind was already moving, turning the numbers over quietly, the way she'd always done in the hotel, cross-referencing, comparing, looking for the shape of the thing beneath the surface. She had come to Silver Creek Ranch looking for a job. She had found one. She had also found something else entirely. Something that had been sitting in that kitchen, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with eyes trained to see it. She thought about Briggs's smile. She thought about the half-second when his smile had dropped. She thought about the way he had been so quick, so smooth, so immediately helpful in trying to send her away. And she began to understand that finding this job might have been the smallest thing that happened to her today. She set her notebook on the kitchen table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. Tomorrow, she would start cooking. But tonight, she was going to think. Because Eleanor Whitmore had survived enough in her life to know that the most dangerous things in the world were not the ones that came at you openly. They were the ones hiding behind a wide smile and a neighborly wave, patient and careful, and certain you were too insignificant to look twice. She was going to look twice. She was going to look as many times as it took. Because she had not walked 14 miles in cracked boots to be sent back to nothing. She had come here to build something, and she was not leaving until she understood exactly what she had walked into. The Kansas night settled over Silver Creek Ranch like a heavy blanket, and in the kitchen at the back of the main house, Eleanor Whitmore sat at the table with her notebook open and her mind working, and she did not sleep for a very long time. Outside, in the bunkhouse across the yard, the ranch hands settled in for the night. Outside, in the barn where he'd gone to check on a horse that wasn't sick, Samuel Briggs stood in the dark and thought about the fat widow who had somehow talked her way into a week's trial. He wasn't worried. Not yet. She was a cook. A nobody. A worn-out widow who had nowhere else to go. He had managed far more capable people than Eleanor Whitmore. He had managed Nathan Caldwell himself for nearly 10 years, and Nathan still didn't know the half of what Briggs had built inside this ranch while he wasn't looking. 1 week, Briggs thought. Let her cook her meals and feel useful. She'd be gone by the end of it. He walked back across the dark yard to the bunkhouse, easy and unhurried, the way a man walks when he believes the ground beneath his feet belongs to him. He did not look back at the kitchen window. He should have. Because inside, in the warm light of a single lamp, Eleanor had opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top, in her clean, careful handwriting, she wrote 2 words. Supply discrepancies. Beneath it, she began writing down every number she had memorized from the ledger. Every single one. Eleanor did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with her notebook open and her lamp burning low, and she wrote down every number she had memorized from that ledger until her hand ached and the page was full. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote them again in a different order, cross-referencing dates, comparing delivery records against what she had physically seen on the shelves with her own eyes. The numbers didn't lie. Numbers never lied. That was the one thing Eleanor had learned in 11 years of managing a hotel kitchen. People lied constantly, easily, sometimes without even realizing they were doing it. But the numbers always told the truth if you knew how to read them. And Eleanor knew how to read them better than most people twice her education, because she had learned not from books, but from necessity, from the desperate arithmetic of a woman who could not afford to be wrong. She had been keeping household accounts since she was 22. She had kept the Granger Hotel's supply budget in her head so precisely that the owner, Mr. Granger himself, used to say he trusted Eleanor's memory more than his own written records. She could look at a column of figures and feel, in some deep instinctive part of her, when something was off. The way a musician hears a wrong note before they can name which one it is. Something was very wrong at Silver Creek Ranch. The ledger showed deliveries of flour, salt, bacon, dried beans, coffee, and a dozen other staples at quantities that would have filled this kitchen 3 times over. But the shelves held maybe a third of what should have been there, and Eleanor had been in enough working kitchens to know that even a crew of hungry ranch hands couldn't eat through that kind of difference. Not in any natural way. The money was going somewhere. The question was where. And more importantly, who? She already had a suspicion. But a suspicion was not proof. And a poor widow accusing a respected ranch manager of theft was not just a difficult position. It was a dangerous one. She had no standing here. She had no allies. She had 1 week on a provisional trial, and if she moved too fast or spoke too soon, she would be back on the road to nowhere before she'd cooked a single meal. So she closed her notebook, blew out the lamp, and went to the small room off the kitchen that Thomas Reed had showed her earlier. The one used for whatever cook was currently in residence, with a narrow bed and a single window facing east. She lay down in her clothes. She thought about James. She often did when things were hard. Not with grief anymore, or not mostly grief, but with the particular loneliness of not having someone to talk through a problem with. James had been a quiet man, but a good listener, and he used to say that Eleanor thought better out loud than any person he'd ever known. She missed that. She missed having someone to think out loud to. "I found something," she whispered to the dark room, "and I don't know what to do with it yet." The room didn't answer. She closed her eyes and made herself sleep for 4 hours, because she knew from long experience that an exhausted mind made mistakes, and she could not afford mistakes. She was up before dawn. By the time the sky outside the kitchen window was turning from black to the deep bruised purple of early morning, Eleanor had already assessed every shelf, every bin, every container in that kitchen with fresh eyes and a clear head. She had identified what was usable and what needed to go. She had found 2 sacks of cornmeal that were still good, a supply of dried beans that would serve well with enough soaking time, some salt pork that was fine, and coffee, real, good coffee, that someone had clearly been hoarding because it was tucked behind a broken crate in the back corner like something precious. She had biscuit flour, lard, and enough eggs from the ranch's own hens to make a proper breakfast. She started cooking. The first ranch hand through the kitchen door stopped dead in his tracks when he smelled the biscuits. He was a big man, broad through the middle, with a beard that needed attending and suspicious eyes. He stood in the doorway for a full 3 seconds, just staring at the tray Eleanor had just pulled from the oven. "Who are you?" he said. "Eleanor Whitmore," she said. "New cook. Sit down, please. Breakfast in 10 minutes. The new—" He stopped, looked at her more carefully. Briggs didn't say nothing about a new cook. "I imagine he didn't," Eleanor said evenly. "Mr. Caldwell hired me yesterday. You're welcome to confirm it with him after breakfast. Sit down." The big man sat down. 3 more hands came in over the next few minutes, and each one went through a version of the same reaction: surprise, uncertainty, a quick visual assessment of Eleanor that she was well practiced in ignoring, and then the smell of hot biscuits winning the argument before they could fully mount one. By the time Nathan Caldwell came through the kitchen at 6:30, there were 7 ranch hands seated at the long table, eating in a silence that was different from the usual silence of men who didn't have anything to say to each other. It was the silence of men who were paying attention to their food. Nathan stopped in the doorway. He looked at the table. He looked at Eleanor at the stove, turning salt pork in a heavy pan. He looked back at the table. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell," Eleanor said without turning around. "Coffee's on the sideboard. Breakfast will be on the table in 5 minutes." "Mrs. Whitmore," he said slowly, "you started early." "A kitchen that starts late loses the whole day," she said. "That's always been my experience." He poured himself coffee and stood at the edge of the room, watching. He did not sit at the table with the hands. She noticed that. He kept himself slightly apart, the way a man does when he's gotten used to being the authority in a room and isn't quite sure how to set it down. But he watched. And Eleanor could feel him watching, and she kept her movements calm and deliberate, because she understood that right now every motion she made in this kitchen was an argument she was presenting. She set the salt pork on the table. She brought out the biscuits. She put a pot of beans, slow-cooked from before dawn, seasoned properly, in the center where everyone could reach. The big bearded man ate 2 biscuits and then said, quietly and to no one in particular, "These are real biscuits." "Course they're real biscuits," said another hand. "I mean real biscuits," the first man said. "Not peat biscuits." There was a murmur of understanding around the table. Eleanor allowed herself a small private satisfaction and turned back to the stove. Nathan set down his coffee cup. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "A word." She dried her hands on a cloth and followed him to the far end of the room, away from the table. He looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of a man who had been lied to enough times to become careful about what he believed. "You organized this kitchen this morning?" he said. "I took inventory and worked with what was here," she said. "How early did you get up?" 3:30, roughly. He looked at her. "That's before any of my hands." "Yes," she said simply. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The supply situation in this kitchen. What did you make of it?" Eleanor met his eyes. This was the moment. She could feel it. She could tell him right now what she'd seen in the ledger, what the numbers suggested, what she suspected. She could lay it all out and trust that he would hear her. But she thought about Briggs. She thought about how fast he had moved yesterday to dismiss her, how smooth he had been, how immediately he had tried to steer Nathan away from giving her even a single week. A man who moved that fast to get rid of someone he'd never met was a man who was careful about who he let near certain things. She was not ready, not yet. "It's disorganized," she said. "I'll need to do a proper full inventory before I can give you an accurate picture of where things stand. Give me a few days." Nathan nodded. "Fair enough." He picked up his coffee again, looked out the window toward the barnyard, and said, almost to himself, "This is the first morning in 6 months this kitchen has smelled like something worth coming to." Then he walked out. Eleanor went back to the stove and began cleaning up. Thomas Reed was the last one at the table. He had eaten slowly, not from lack of appetite. She could tell from the amount he'd consumed that appetite wasn't the issue, but from the kind of deliberate appreciation that people practiced when they weren't sure how long a good thing would last. When the other hands had gone, he brought his plate to her. "You don't have to do that," she said. "My mama raised me right," he said. He set the plate in the basin and looked at her. That was the best breakfast this kitchen has seen since Mrs. Hartley left. Who was Mrs. Hartley? Cook Nathan had about 2 years back. Old woman, mean as a briar patch, but she could cook. He paused. Briggs ran her off. Eleanor looked at him steadily. Did he? Said she was too slow for the work, but... Thomas stopped, glanced at the door, dropped his voice slightly. She wasn't slow. She was asking questions about the supply orders. Everybody knew it. Nobody said it. The silence between them was careful and full. "Thomas," Eleanor said quietly, "how long have you been on this ranch?" 3 years. "And in those 3 years, has the food situation always been like this? The shortages, the disorganization?" Thomas leaned against the basin and crossed his arms. He was young, but he had old eyes, the kind of eyes that had watched things and thought about what they were watching without always knowing what to do about it. "It got worse after Briggs took over the supply orders," he said. "Used to be Nathan handled all of that himself, but Nathan's been stretched thin the last few years, trying to manage the land and the cattle and the business side of things all at once. And Briggs stepped up and said he'd handle the supply side. Seemed like he was helping." "Seemed like," Eleanor said. "Yeah," Thomas said quietly. "Seemed like." He pushed off from his basin, pulled his hat from the peg by the door, and settled it on his head. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "you seem like a woman who pays attention to things." "I try to," she said. "Then pay attention to this." He held her gaze. "Be careful who sees what you're doing when you're looking around this kitchen. That's all I'm saying." He walked out. Eleanor stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment, listening to his boots cross the yard outside. Then she turned back to the shelves and began the slow, careful, methodical work of building a record she could actually use. She didn't touch the original ledger again. Not yet. Instead, she started fresh. Her own notebook, her own columns, her own system. Every morning, she documented what supplies she used. Every time a delivery came, she was there at the back door to receive it herself, counting every item against what the delivery record said, writing the actual count in her own hand before she signed anything. The first delivery came 3 days in. A supply wagon from a merchant in town pulled up to the back of the kitchen, and a boy of about 16 handed her a paper and said the delivery was from Pearson's Goods, same as always. Eleanor looked at the paper. Then she looked at the wagon. Then she started counting. The paper said 40 pounds of flour. The wagon had 23. She stood very still for a moment. "Son," she said carefully, "this paper says 40 pounds of flour." The boy blinked. "Yes, ma'am. Your wagon has 23. The boy looked at the wagon, looked at the paper, looked genuinely confused, which told Eleanor the problem was not with the delivery boy. "I just load what Mr. Briggs orders, ma'am," he said. "He comes in himself sometimes and tells my pa what to put together. Sometimes he changes it from what's written down. Says he'll adjust the paperwork later." "Does he?" Eleanor said. "Yes, ma'am. He's been doing the ordering for Silver Creek for years. My pa knows him real well." Eleanor signed for what was actually there, 23 pounds, and wrote the real number clearly in her own hand on her copy, then made a note in her notebook. She sent the boy on his way. She stood at the back door of that kitchen and felt something cold settle in her chest. Not fear exactly. More like the particular gravity that comes when you've suspected something bad and the world has just confirmed it. Briggs wasn't just skimming money on false invoices. He was controlling the actual delivery amounts, collecting payment for quantities that never arrived, and adjusting the paperwork after the fact so the numbers told whatever story he wanted them to tell. He had been doing this for years. Nathan Caldwell had been paying for 40 pounds of flour and receiving 23 over and over and over again on every supply line coming into this ranch, and he had believed, because Samuel Briggs had told him so, that the ranch's financial struggles were the result of bad seasons and difficult markets. The fury that moved through Eleanor was quiet and deep, the kind that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. She went back inside and wrote down every number. That evening, Samuel Briggs came to the kitchen. He came after supper, when the hands had gone, and Eleanor was cleaning up alone, and he came with his hands in his pockets and his wide smile preceding him through the doorway like a warm front before a storm. "Evening, Mrs. Whitmore," he said pleasantly. "Settling in all right?" "Fine, thank you," Eleanor said. She kept her back to him, wiping down the stove surface, her movements unhurried. "Heard you had a little confusion with the delivery boy this morning," he said. She turned then, because she wanted to see his face when she answered. "No confusion," she said. "The count on the delivery didn't match the order paper. I signed for what was actually received. That's standard practice." Briggs smiled. "Well, sure. But the thing is, sometimes there are arrangements in place that aren't obvious from the outside. Nathan likes the paperwork handled a certain way, and I've been managing the system long enough to know the wrinkles. Why don't you just let me handle the supply side and focus on the cooking? That's what you're here for, after all." Eleanor looked at him. "Mr. Briggs," she said pleasantly, "Mr. Caldwell hired me to run this kitchen. Running a kitchen means knowing exactly what comes in and what goes out. I'll be signing for all deliveries going forward and keeping my own count. I'm sure that won't be a problem." Briggs's smile didn't change, but his eyes did. Just for a moment, a flicker, quickly controlled, something moved through them that was not pleasant at all. "Of course," he said smoothly. "No problem whatsoever." He left. Eleanor turned back to the stove. Her hands were completely steady. Her heart was not, because she understood now, fully and clearly, that she had just shown her hand a fraction more than she intended to, and that Samuel Briggs was not a stupid man. He would be watching her more carefully now, which meant she needed to move faster. She had been planning to take 2 weeks to build her full evidence record. She was going to have to do it in one. The next morning, Thomas Reed appeared at the kitchen door before breakfast with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that told her he had something to say and wasn't sure he should say it. "Thomas," she said, "come in and say it." He came in. He sat at the table. He turned his hat over in his hands twice. "Briggs talked to a couple of the hands last night," he said, "after supper. I wasn't supposed to hear, but the bunkhouse walls are thin." "What did he say?" "He said you were a troublemaker. Said you came here under false pretenses, that you'd written a letter misrepresenting your experience, that Nathan was too soft-hearted to see it. He said—" Thomas stopped. His jaw worked. "He said a woman like you, in your situation, without any family or connections, would say anything to get a roof over her head, that you couldn't be trusted." The words landed exactly the way words like that always landed on Eleanor, with a dull, familiar weight, the weight of every dismissal she'd survived before this one. She poured 2 cups of coffee. She set one in front of Thomas. She sat down across from him. "What did the hands say?" she asked. Thomas looked at his coffee cup. Couple of them nodded along. Billy Crane especially. He never liked having a woman in the kitchen to begin with, but most of them. He looked up. Most of them were quiet, and quiet men aren't always the same as convinced men. "No," Eleanor said. "They're not, Mrs. Whitmore." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "I've been on this ranch 3 years. I have seen 2 other people try to flag what's been happening with the supplies. One of them just left without saying a word. The other one, Hartley's husband actually, he worked the north pasture. He got into it with Briggs directly. Nathan had to let him go because Briggs told Nathan he was causing trouble." Eleanor was very still. "Nathan didn't know why he was really letting that man go," Thomas said quietly. "Briggs framed it as a discipline issue, and Nathan—" He stopped, rubbed his face. "Nathan trusts Briggs. Trusted him since the beginning. Briggs was here when Nathan had nothing. When the ranch was just a few acres and a broken-down barn. Briggs worked beside him. Nathan believes he owes him something." Eleanor absorbed this. The picture was becoming clearer and more complicated all at once. This wasn't just a story about a dishonest manager stealing from an oblivious employer. This was a story about loyalty weaponized, about a man who had made himself indispensable, who had woven himself so deep into Nathan Caldwell's history that the truth, when it came, would feel not like information, but like betrayal. which meant Eleanor's evidence couldn't just be accurate. It had to be undeniable. "Thomas," she said, "I need a favor." He looked at her directly. "Name it." "The merchant, Pearson's Goods. Is there someone there I could speak to privately? Someone who might tell me the truth about the order records? Not the boy, his father." Thomas thought about it. "Old Walt Pearson. He's honest enough. He doesn't like what's been happening, I think, but he needs the ranch's business, and he can't afford to go against Briggs directly. If someone came to him right, though, could you arrange a meeting?" Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "You know what you're doing," he said slowly. "You know what you're walking into." "Yes," she said, "and you're doing it anyway." "I didn't come here to look the other way," Eleanor said. "I've been looked through my whole life, Thomas. I know what it feels like, and I know what it costs people who don't have anyone looking out for them." Thomas Reed picked up his coffee cup. He drank. He set it down. "I'll talk to Walt Pearson," he said. 3 days later, Thomas came back from town with a message. Walt Pearson would see her Thursday morning, before the ranch supply wagon usually arrived, at the back of the store. Eleanor spent Wednesday night organizing everything she had gathered so far into a clean, clear record. Her own delivery counts, the original ledger numbers she had memorized, the dates, the specific discrepancies, laid out in the same neat handwriting she had used to keep the Granger Hotel's accounts for 11 years. It wasn't enough yet, but it was the beginning of something that would be. And on Thursday morning, before Nathan Caldwell was awake, and before Samuel Briggs had any reason to wonder where she was, Eleanor Whitmore put on her coat, picked up her notebook, and walked into town. Walt Pearson was a small man with a heavy conscience, which Eleanor recognized immediately because she had met plenty of both kinds in her life. The ones carrying something they wished they could put down, and the ones who never noticed the weight at all. He looked at her across the back counter of his store, with the expression of a man who has been half hoping someone would come through that door for a long time, and is now slightly terrified that they have. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "Thomas told me you might be coming. Thank you for seeing me," she said. "Mr. Pearson, I'm going to be plain with you because I think that's what this situation calls for. I believe the supply orders for Silver Creek Ranch have been altered, that goods have been ordered and billed in quantities larger than what was actually delivered, and that the difference has been going somewhere other than the ranch. I believe you may know something about how that happened, and I'm asking you to tell me the truth, because the man being harmed is a man who built that ranch with his own hands and deserves better than what's being done to him." Walt Pearson looked at the counter. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Briggs has been adjusting the orders for years. He comes in himself, sometimes changes what was written, takes some of the goods directly, says he'll handle the accounting on his end. I knew the numbers weren't right. I knew what it looked like." He looked up. "But he's been the contact for Silver Creek since before I can remember. And if I said something and Caldwell didn't believe it—" "I understand," Eleanor said. "I need to know if you have your own records, your own copies of what was actually ordered versus what was actually delivered." Pearson looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned, went to a wooden cabinet at the back of the store, and pulled out a leather-bound accounting book that had seen better days but was clearly meticulously maintained. "I keep my own books," he said quietly. "Always have. Even when I didn't know what I'd ever do with them." Eleanor looked at this book in his hands. She felt something move through her. Not relief exactly, not yet, because relief was premature, but the specific quiet certainty of a woman who has been doing the right thing in the dark for long enough that when a door finally opens, she knows what she's looking at. "May I look?" she said. He handed her the book. She opened it and began to read, and there it was, page after page of it, stretching back years. Walt Pearson's careful, honest records of every order placed, every amount delivered, every discrepancy noted in a small, worried hand in the margins. He had been keeping the truth of it all along, not knowing what to do with it, not knowing who to trust. Eleanor looked up. "Mr. Pearson," she said, "would you be willing to let me make copies of the relevant pages?" He nodded, slowly, like a man making a decision he'd been putting off for a long time. "Yes," he said, "I would." She spent 2 hours in the back of Pearson's store with her notebook and a pen, copying everything that mattered. When she walked back to Silver Creek Ranch that afternoon, her notebook was heavier than it had been that morning. So was her understanding of what she was carrying. Because she knew now. She had the shape of it, the full shape, years of it, carefully documented and quietly corroborated. And what she had was not just a suspicion, or an irregularity, or a vague sense that something was wrong. What she had was the truth. The truth about Samuel Briggs. The truth about what he had done to Nathan Caldwell. The truth that someone loyal to this ranch had been holding in a backroom ledger for years, waiting for someone with the courage and the clarity to come and use it. She had walked into Silver Creek Ranch with one old suitcase and the last scraps of a life that had taken everything from her. And she was walking back to it, carrying the thing that could change everything. The question now was not whether she had enough. The question was whether Nathan Caldwell would be willing to hear it, and she already understood, with the clear, unsentimental intelligence of a woman who had spent her life being underestimated by men who trusted other men before they trusted her, that the answer to that question was not guaranteed. Not yet. But she was not done yet either. She walked back to Silver Creek Ranch in the late afternoon with Walt Pearson's numbers copied into her notebook and a weight in her chest that had nothing to do with the miles. The truth was one thing. Delivering it was another. She had spent the walk back turning it over in her mind, the way she turned everything over. Methodically, honestly, without the comfort of pretending it was simpler than it was. She had enough documentation now to make a case. She had her own delivery counts. She had the original ledger numbers she'd memorized from the kitchen shelf. She had Walt Pearson's backroom records stretching years into the past, page after careful page of a man quietly documenting a wrong he didn't know how to right. What she did not have was Nathan Caldwell's trust. And without that, none of the rest of it meant anything. She came through the back gate of the ranch yard just as the hands were finishing up the evening chores, and the first person she saw was Samuel Briggs. I was standing near the barn door, talking to Billy Crane, the broad-shouldered hand who had been the most openly skeptical of her presence in the kitchen from the first morning. They were speaking quietly, and when Briggs saw Eleanor cross the yard, he stopped talking and watched her with an expression that was perfectly neutral and told her everything. He knew she had gone somewhere today. He might not know where yet. But he knew. She walked past without acknowledging either of them, kept her pace steady, her chin level, her notebook tucked under her arm where it was not visible, and went straight into the kitchen. Thomas was waiting for her inside. I was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and the look of a man who had been sitting there long enough to have drunk the coffee cold without noticing. Briggs asked where you were this morning, he said without preamble. Eleanor set her notebook on the table and sat across from him. What did you tell him? That I didn't know, which was true when he asked. Thomas leaned forward. Eleanor, he's been talking to the hands all day, not just Crane. He got to Hector and Davies too, telling them you've been going through the ranch records, that you're overstepping, that Nathan's going to hear about it. Nathan should hear about it, she said. From me. Before Briggs gets there first. Thomas stared at her. You're going to him tonight? I don't have a choice anymore. You don't have all of it yet, though, Thomas said. You told me yourself you wanted more time. Briggs is moving, Eleanor said quietly. If I wait, he'll control the story before I can tell it. A man who has spent years managing what Nathan sees and hears is not going to sit still while I build a case against him. I have enough. It has to be enough. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He looked at the notebook on the table. He's going to push back hard, he said. Briggs, he'll call you a liar. He'll say you're a desperate woman who found a way into this ranch and is now trying to manipulate the situation for her own benefit. And Nathan has known Briggs for 10 years. I know, Eleanor said, and he's known you for less than 2 weeks. I know that too. Thomas looked at her with something that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, but lived in the space between the two. Then why do you look like you've already decided? He said. Eleanor picked up the notebook. She held it in both hands and looked down at the cover for a moment. Worn and plain, the same notebook she'd been carrying since she left Wichita. the same one she'd used to plan meals and track costs and write down every number that mattered. Because doing the right thing doesn't require certainty about the outcome, she said. It only requires certainty about the right thing. She stood up. She smoothed her dress. She picked up the notebook. "Where is Nathan right now?" she said. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "Study. North end of the house. He works there in the evenings." Eleanor nodded once and walked out of the kitchen. The hall of the main house was quiet. The ranch hands were in the bunkhouse, supper was done, and the house held that particular evening stillness that large buildings took on when the day's work was finished, but the night hadn't fully settled in yet. Eleanor walked the length of the hall, past the coat rack by the front door, past the framed map of Kansas on the wall, past the narrow table with the oil lamp that needed trimming, and stopped in front of the closed door at the far end. She could hear the scratch of a pen inside, the small, focused sounds of a man working through numbers. She knocked. The scratching stopped. "Come in." Nathan Caldwell was sitting at a desk covered in papers, his reading glasses pushed down his nose, a pen in his right hand, and the expression of a man who had been deep in a problem and was surfacing reluctantly. He looked at Eleanor in the doorway, registered the notebook in her hands, and straightened slightly in his chair. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Something wrong in the kitchen?" "No," she said. "May I come in?" He gestured to the chair across the desk. She came in. She sat down. She placed the notebook on her knee and folded her hands over it, and she looked at him directly, the way she had learned to look at people when she needed them to understand she was not performing, that what was coming was real and it mattered. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I need to tell you something that is going to be very difficult to hear, and I need to ask you to hear all of it before you respond." Nathan set his pen down. His face didn't change much, but something in him became very still. The stillness of a man who has learned that sentences beginning that way almost never lead anywhere comfortable. "Go ahead," he said. She told him. She started from the beginning, from the moment she opened the supply ledger on that first afternoon and felt the wrongness in the numbers before she could name it. She told him about her own delivery counts, the flour that was billed at 40 pounds and arrived at 23, the pattern that repeated across every supply category she had been able to track. She told him about Thomas's account of Mrs. Hartley and the ranch hand who'd been let go for asking questions. She told him about her visit to Walt Pearson and about the backroom ledger that Pearson had been keeping for years, the honest record of a man who had known something was wrong and hadn't known who to bring it to. She opened her notebook and laid it on the desk in front of him. She showed him her columns, her dates, her counts. She showed him the figures she had copied from Pearson's records, years of them, the discrepancies mounting steadily, the money that had gone nowhere, that a legitimate supply operation could account for. Nathan didn't speak while she talked. I didn't move much either. He sat with his hands flat on the desk on either side of the notebook and looked at the figures she was showing him, and his face went through a series of things that Eleanor watched carefully without commenting on. Disbelief, then a kind of controlled blankness that she recognized as a man refusing to react until he was certain, then something harder and quieter underneath that. When she finished, the room was very still. Nathan looked at the notebook for a long moment. Then he said, "This is a serious accusation." "Yes," she said, "it is. You're telling me Samuel Briggs has been stealing from this ranch for years. I'm telling you the numbers suggest that a significant amount of money paid for supplies never resulted in those supplies arriving. I'm telling you the pattern is consistent and documented across multiple sources. I'm telling you a reputable merchant in town has been keeping his own records of it and is willing to corroborate what I've found." Nathan looked up from the notebook. His eyes were the hard, flat gray of a man trying not to feel something before he was ready to. "Samuel has been with me since the beginning," he said. "He worked beside me when this ranch was nothing, when I had 1 barn and 40 head of cattle and couldn't afford to pay a man properly. He stayed. He worked. He never asked for more than what was agreed." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very gently, "Mr. Caldwell, a man can do real good in the beginning and real harm afterward. Those two things can both be true at the same time." The muscle in Nathan's jaw tightened. Why would he do it? Nathan said. He has a good life here. Good wages, good standing. His wages, Eleanor said carefully, are the wages you agreed on years ago. But a man who believes he helped build something may come to believe he is owed more than what was agreed, especially when he can see ways to take it that no one is watching closely enough to catch. Something crossed Nathan's face then. Not quite anger, not quite grief, but something with the weight of both. He stood up abruptly. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, and Eleanor waited, because she had said what needed to be said, and now it had to find its place in him at the pace it could manage. I want to see Pearson's records myself, he said finally, without turning around. Not your copies, the originals. I expected you would, she said. I'll arrange it. And I want to cross-check the invoices in the ranch files, against what you've shown me. I'll help you do that. He turned then. He looked at her across the room with an expression she couldn't fully read, complicated and tired, and something that might have been the beginning of a different kind of seeing. Mrs. Whitmore, he said slowly, why did you come to me with this? You've been here less than 2 weeks. You have no stake in this ranch. You could have kept your head down, cooked your meals, collected your wage. Eleanor looked at him steadily. Because you're being robbed, she said simply. And I've spent enough of my life watching people get taken advantage of by people who were certain no one was paying close enough attention. I pay attention, Mr. Caldwell. It's what I do. And I wasn't put on this earth to look the other way. Nathan stared at her. For the first time since she'd walked into this study, he was looking at her the way she had hoped he would. Not at her size, not at the plain dress, not at the worn notebook, but at the woman who had sat in his kitchen in the dark before 3:30 in the morning and started counting the things that didn't add up. Give me 2 days, he said. I need to look at this myself. Of course, she said. She stood, picked up the notebook, and was almost to the door when Nathan said, Mrs. Whitmore, she stopped. Your week's trial, he said. It ended 3 days ago. She turned. I know, she said. I didn't say anything because... He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. You were doing good work, and I didn't have a reason to send you away. Eleanor held his gaze. And now? She said. He looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough to mean something. Now, he said quietly, I have even less of one. She walked back to the kitchen. She did not let herself feel the relief of it until she was through the door and alone, and even then she didn't let it last long because she understood they were nowhere near finished. Nathan needed to verify everything himself. That was right, that was fair. She would not have trusted a man who simply took her word for it. And the 2 days between now and that verification were going to be the most dangerous 2 days since she'd arrived. Because Briggs would feel the shift. Men like Briggs always did. She was barely through the kitchen door before she heard footsteps behind her, and she turned to find Samuel Briggs standing in the kitchen doorway with his hands in his pockets and his easy smile and eyes that had gone flat and careful in a way that the smile was trying very hard to cover. Evening, Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Had a chance to talk to Nathan tonight? I did, she said pleasantly. She turned to the stove, put the kettle on, kept her back to him. Anything I should know about? He said. Ranch business, she said. Nothing that concerns you directly. The silence behind her was the kind of silence that had edges. You know, Briggs said, his voice dropping just slightly, losing the pleasant surface. I've tried to be friendly with you. I've tried to make you feel welcome here. But I'm going to be honest with you now, because I think you'd rather that than the other thing. Eleanor turned around. She faced him squarely. You're not welcome here, Briggs said. Quiet, even. The smile gone now. You came in here without being asked. You've been going through things that aren't your business, and you've been filling Nathan's head with. Whatever it is you've been filling it with. You're a cook, a temporary cook. And when Nathan figures out what you're actually doing here, you'll be back on the road with that suitcase before the week is out. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about all the things she could say. She thought about what it would feel like to say them. Then she said, very calmly, The kettle's about to boil. Good night, Mr. Briggs. He stared at her. The kettle began to whistle. Briggs turned and walked out. Eleanor poured her tea with steady hands and stood at the stove and breathed, slow and deliberate, the way she had learned to breathe in the years after James died, when breathing deliberately was sometimes the only thing standing between her and the dark. She was frightened. She was not going to pretend otherwise, even to herself. Briggs was cornered and he knew it, and cornered men with 10 years of carefully built position on a ranch didn't simply walk away because a widow cook had shown their employer some numbers. He was going to fight. The question was how. She found out the next morning. Briggs had gone to town. Thomas told her at breakfast, his face tight with the specific worry of someone who has seen this before and knows how it ends. Briggs had taken a horse at first light and ridden to town, and two of the hands, Crane and Davies, had been seen talking near the barn before sunup, quiet and close in the way men talk when they've been told something and are deciding what to believe. "He's building something," Thomas said. "Getting ahead of whatever you told Nathan last night." "I know," Eleanor said. She slid a plate of eggs in front of him with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. "Let him." "Eleanor," Thomas said, and his voice had something raw in it, the voice of a young man who had been hoping things would go differently. "If he gets to the right people in town first, it won't matter what the numbers say. They'll see a strange woman who showed up 2 weeks ago and started making accusations against a man everybody's known for years, and they'll believe him," she said. "I know." "Then how are you not scared right now?" She sat down across from him. "I am scared," she said. "But being scared doesn't change what the numbers say, and it doesn't change what Walt Pearson has in that ledger. What Briggs is doing right now, talking, maneuvering, managing the story, all of that is the kind of thing that works on people who only have a feeling. I don't have a feeling. I have documentation." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You've done this before." "Not exactly this," she said. "But I've been in rooms where people had already decided what I was before I opened my mouth. And I've learned that the only answer to that is to be so precisely, exactly, undeniably right that the decision has to change." Thomas was quiet. Then he said, "Nathan went to his files first thing this morning. I saw him going through the storage room where he keeps the old invoices. I was in there for 2 hours." Eleanor's heart moved quietly in her chest. "Good," she said. Nathan came to the kitchen at mid-morning. He came alone, without announcement, and he stood in the kitchen doorway with the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy since before sunrise and was trying to figure out how to set it down without dropping it. Eleanor was at the work table, rolling out dough for the noon meal, and she kept her hands moving because she had learned that steady hands communicated things that words sometimes couldn't. "I went through the invoices," Nathan said. She kept rolling. "And? 6 years' worth," he said. His voice was flat in the way that voices go flat when the emotion in them is too large for the usual containers. "I cross-checked every supply invoice against the numbers you gave me. The delivery records against the payment records." He stopped. Eleanor set the rolling pin down. She turned to look at him. Nathan's jaw was tight. His eyes were doing that controlled flat thing again, but underneath it, she could see what it was costing him. "It goes back further than you showed me," he said. "The pattern starts about 8 months after I gave him full control of the supply ordering, which would have been—" He stopped again. "8 years ago," Eleanor said quietly. Nathan looked at her. "8 years," he said. It came out barely above a whisper. Not because he was being quiet, because that was all the volume he had for it right now. She didn't offer him anything soft. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "I know how hard this is," because she respected him too much to cover a wound that needed to be looked at with something that would only delay the looking. "There's more," she said. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. "Tell me." "The missing ledger. The hidden one, behind the kitchen storage shelves. The one I found my first afternoon here. It's gone." Nathan went very still. "When did you last see it?" he said. "The morning after I found it. I left it in place intentionally. I didn't want to alarm anyone. When I checked again 3 days later, it was gone." She paused. "Briggs knew I'd been in the kitchen. He would have known I might have seen it." "He took it," Nathan said. "I believe so." Which means he knows, Nathan said. He knows what you found. He knows what you've been building. Yes. Nathan looked at her with an expression that was shifting, moving through something complicated and arriving somewhere harder and clearer. And you came to me anyway, he said. Knowing he'd already moved. Knowing he'd try to discredit you. The longer I waited, the more time he had, she said. Nathan turned away from her. He walked to the far end of the kitchen and stood there with his hands at his sides and his back to her. And Eleanor watched him the way she'd been watching people her whole life. Waiting, patient, reading the stillness. He turned back. I'm riding to see Walt Pearson today, he said. This afternoon. I need to hear it from him directly. He'll tell you the truth, Eleanor said. He's been wanting to for a long time. Nathan nodded once. Then he said, Where is Briggs right now? He went to town this morning. Something moved through Nathan's face. Quick, contained, decisive. I want you to stay in the main house today, he said. Not the kitchen, the main house. I'll have Thomas bring you what you need. Eleanor looked at him. Why? Because Briggs is going to come back from town with something, he said. And I want you somewhere with walls I trust before he does. It was the first time Nathan Caldwell had said anything that sounded like protection. Eleanor felt the weight of it quietly and said, All right. Briggs came back from town that evening. Eleanor heard him from the sitting room where Nathan had set her up with paper and a lamp, heard the sound of his horse in the yard, heard voices outside, Briggs and Crane, brief and low, and then the sound of boots on the porch. Nathan was waiting for him in the front hall. Eleanor heard it all through the wall. Where have you been? Nathan's voice, quiet, controlled. The voice of a man who already knows and is giving the other person one last chance to tell the truth. Town, Briggs said. Easy, natural. Had some business to attend to with the suppliers. Wanted to get ahead of some of the mix-up with the supply counts. That woman's been causing confusion with the delivery boys, and I wanted to straighten it out before it became a real problem. Which suppliers? A pause. Short. Pearson's mostly. He's been getting some confused. I spoke with Walt Pearson today, Nathan said. In person, this afternoon. The silence that followed was the longest 2 seconds Eleanor had heard in recent memory. Is that right? Briggs said. His voice had changed. Not much, but enough. He showed me his records, Nathan said. His own records. Not the ones you've been adjusting, his. Another silence. Nathan. Briggs's voice had shifted fully now, dropped the easy pleasantness, gone to something more careful and more dangerous. Whatever that woman has been telling you, you need to think about where it's coming from. She showed up here 2 weeks ago with nothing. No family, no connections, no references that check out. She's been going through things she has no business touching, making accusations about a man who has been loyal to you for a decade. The invoices, Samuel. Silence. I found them this morning, Nathan said. All 6 years of them. I compared them myself. Every one. Briggs said nothing. 10 years, Nathan said, and his voice cracked on it, just slightly, just enough. 10 years I trusted you. I believed you when you said the ranch was struggling. I cut wages. I sold off the east pasture. I told myself it was the market, the drought, bad luck. All of it. All of it while you... I built this ranch with you, Briggs said sharply. I was here when it was nothing, before you had 2 nickels to knock together. Whatever I took, I earned, Nathan. I earned it when no one else would have stayed. Get off my land, Nathan said. The hall went silent. Nathan. Tonight, Nathan said. You're done here tonight. Eleanor sat in the sitting room with her hands folded in her lap and her heart beating hard in the quiet. And she heard the sound of Briggs's boots on the porch, and then in the yard, sharp and fast, the sound of a man who has finally run out of room to maneuver. She heard Nathan's footsteps in the hall. The sitting room door opened. He stood in the doorway. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning, and also somehow more solidly himself, like a man who had been carrying weight in a way that bent him slightly, and has set it down, and is standing up straight for the first time in a long while. He looked at Eleanor. He's leaving tonight, he said. I heard, she said quietly. Nathan came in and sat down heavily in the chair across from her. He took off his glasses and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment. Then he dropped his hands and looked at her. "He told people in town," Nathan said. "That's what he went there for. He told them you were manipulating me, that you were a dishonest woman who came here under false pretenses." He paused. "He told them." He stopped. His jaw tightened. "He told them a woman like you had nothing to offer a man like me except trouble." Eleanor absorbed that, the familiar sting of it, the familiar weight. "I know," she said. "The town's going to be difficult," Nathan said. "For a while. People believed him. He's been charming people in that town for years, the same way he charmed me." "I know that too," she said. Nathan looked at her across the small distance of the sitting room, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The lamp between them threw a warm, unsteady light across the papers on the table, and the plain cover of Eleanor's notebook, and the tired, honest faces of two people who had arrived at the same difficult truth by different roads. "Mrs. Whitmore," Nathan said finally. "Eleanor," she said. "Please." He looked at her. "Eleanor," he said. And something in the way he said it, careful, slightly unfamiliar, like a man trying out a word he has reason to believe matters, made her chest do something quiet and unexpected. "You walked 14 miles to stand at my door," he said, "and the first thing I did was try to send you away." She looked at him steadily. "You gave me the week." "I almost didn't." "But you did," she said. "That's what matters." Nathan was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands. Then he looked up. "Stay," he said. "Not just the trial. Not just until I find someone else. I'm asking you to stay and help me rebuild what's been taken apart." He paused. "This ranch needs someone who can see what I miss, and I—" He stopped, said the rest of it carefully. "I think I have been missing a great deal." Eleanor looked at him. Outside, in the ranch yard, she could hear the sounds of Briggs loading his things. Sharp, resentful sounds, the sounds of a man whose carefully constructed world was coming down around him. And inside, in the warm lamplight, something else was beginning. Something small and real and not yet named. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I'll stay." Briggs was gone by midnight. Eleanor knew because she heard the horse leave. A single set of hooves moving fast across the hard-packed ground of the ranch yard. No hesitation, no slow walk of a man, uncertain about his direction. Just the sharp, receding sound of someone who had run out of choices and knew it. She was sitting at the kitchen table when it happened, her notebook open in front of her, her tea gone cold. She listened to the sound fade into the Kansas dark, and then sat in the silence that came after, which was a different kind of silence than the ranch usually held. Emptier in one way, fuller in another. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway 10 minutes later, still dressed, hat in hand, with the expression of a man who had been awake waiting for something and wasn't sure yet how to feel about it now that it had happened. "He's gone," Thomas said. "I heard," Eleanor said. Thomas came in and sat down across from her. He looked at the cold tea and then at Eleanor's face with the careful attention of someone trying to read weather. "You all right?" he said. Eleanor considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things. "I think so," she said. "Ask me again in the morning when I know whether the ranch is still standing." Thomas almost smiled. Almost. "Nathan's in his study. He's been in there since Briggs left. I think he's going through more of the invoices." "Let him," Eleanor said. "He needs to see all of it himself. That's how he'll know it's real." "He already knows it's real," Thomas said quietly. "I think that's the problem." She understood what he meant. Knowing something with your mind and knowing it with your whole self were two different kinds of knowing, and Nathan Caldwell was somewhere in the territory between them. A man in the process of revising 10 years of his own history, which was not a quick or comfortable thing to do. She left him to it. She went to bed at last and slept the deep, flat sleep of someone whose body has finally agreed to stop holding everything up by itself. In the morning, the ranch felt different. Not quieter exactly. The hands were still there. The horses still needed feeding. The work of the place still moved forward the way it always did. But there was a particular kind of tension that had been living in the yard and the bunkhouse and the kitchen for weeks. A tension Eleanor had felt from her first morning there without being able to name it, and now it was gone. In its place was something uncertain, but cleaner. Like a room after a window has been opened. Billy Crane did not come to breakfast. Eleanor noted the empty chair and said nothing. Hector and Davies came in late, looked at their plates, and said nothing either, which was a different kind of nothing. The kind that meant they were waiting to see which way things would fall before they chose a direction. Thomas ate his breakfast and then stayed to help her wash up, which he didn't usually do, and while they worked he said quietly, "Crane rode out this morning, early, went after Briggs." Eleanor rinsed a plate. "Did Nathan know?" "Nathan told him he could go or he could stay, but if he stayed, he worked under the same terms as everyone else. Crane decided to go." "And the others?" Thomas glanced toward the table where Hector and Davies were finishing their coffee. "Davies is solid. He's been here 5 years and he knows what side his bread is buttered on. Hector's younger. He looked up to Briggs." He paused. "But Hector's a fair man mostly. He'll come around when he sees what things look like without Briggs managing them." Eleanor dried her hands on the cloth and looked at the table. "I'm going to make a better lunch today than yesterday," she said. "That's all I can do." Thomas looked at her for a moment. "You really believe that?" "I believe in feeding people well," she said. "I have found that it is one of the more reliable ways to communicate that you mean what you say." She meant it, and she did it. The noon meal that day was the best she'd produced since arriving at Silver Creek. Biscuits again, because she had learned that biscuits were a kind of language on this ranch, but also a proper stew with the salt pork and dried vegetables, and a dried apple cobbler that she'd managed from the supply reserves with just enough sugar to do the job. Hector ate 2 bowls of stew without looking up. When he pushed back from the table, he looked at Eleanor directly for the first time since Briggs had left, and said, "This is real good, ma'am." "Thank you, Hector," she said. He nodded once, put his hat on, and went back out to work. Thomas caught her eye across the kitchen. She turned back to the stove without acknowledging it, because she knew better than to make more of a small thing than it was. But she filed it away, the way she filed everything. Nathan came to the kitchen that afternoon. He had the look of a man who had not slept much, which Eleanor recognized easily enough, because she had worn that look herself for the better part of 2 years after James died. His eyes were clear but tired, and he moved with the slightly careful deliberateness of someone operating on less than full rest. He sat at the kitchen table without being asked. Eleanor poured him coffee without being asked. It was the first time they had been in the kitchen together without the specific weight of the crisis between them, and the absence of that weight made the room feel slightly different, smaller, maybe, or just more ordinary in a way that was its own kind of intimacy. "I sent a message to the sheriff this morning," Nathan said. Eleanor looked at him. "In town?" "Reardon County. I've documented everything. The invoices, the discrepancies, Pearson's records. I want a legal record of what happened here." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Briggs may have left, but I don't intend to let it end there." "Good," Eleanor said. "The sheriff knows Briggs," Nathan said. "They've been friendly. I don't know how that'll go." "It'll go the way it goes," she said. "You've done the right thing by reporting it. What the sheriff does with it is his responsibility, not yours." Nathan looked at her. "You make things very simple," he said. It was not a criticism. "No," she said. "I make things clear. Those aren't the same thing." He almost smiled. It didn't make it all the way to a smile, not quite, but the shape of one moved through his face, and Eleanor felt it land somewhere quiet and warm in her chest. "The hands," Nathan said. "I want to address them tonight. All of them. Explain what happened, what I found, where things stand. They deserve to hear it from me directly, not through rumor." "They do," Eleanor said. "Thomas will back you up." "Thomas is a good man," Nathan said. Then he added, looking at her steadily, "You knew that right away, didn't you? About Thomas." "He brought my plate to the basin that first morning," she said. "A man raised right doesn't stop being raised right because the situation's difficult." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, he said. And the way he said her name had settled into something more natural now, less careful, like a word that had found its place in his mouth. What Briggs said in town. About you. She kept her face level. You don't have to. I do, he said. Because it's going to follow you. Not just for a week. People in these small towns have long memories, and Briggs was well liked for a long time. They're going to look at you differently. Some of them are going to repeat what he said. And you're going to have to walk into that town and do business for this ranch and hold your head up while people who don't know you have already decided what they think. She looked at him. Mr. Caldwell, she said. I have been managing people's opinions of me since I was old enough to understand that the world had them. I know what I am. I know what I'm worth. What Briggs said doesn't change either of those things. It only says something about him. Nathan held her gaze. I'm going to correct it, he said. What he said. I'm going to correct it publicly. Eleanor didn't say anything for a moment. You don't have to do that, she said finally. It came out slightly quieter than she intended. I know I don't have to, he said. I want to. The kitchen held that for a moment. Then Eleanor turned back to the stove, because she needed something to do with her hands while she thought about what that meant and what it felt like, and whether she was allowed to let it feel like anything at all. The town meeting's Thursday, she said. If you're going to say something, that would be the time. Thursday, Nathan said. I'll be there. He was. Eleanor didn't go. Not because she was afraid, or not only that, but because she understood that Nathan's defense of her would land differently without her in the room. A man defending a woman who's standing right there looks like he's performing. A man defending someone who isn't there to hear it, who doesn't know he's going to do it, looks like a man who actually means it. She found out what happened from 3 different sources before noon the next day. Thomas was first, coming into the kitchen with his hat pushed back and an expression of someone who had just watched something unexpected go well. He stood up in front of the whole town, Thomas said. Didn't wait to be asked. Just stood up and said he had something that needed to be said. He sat down. He told them what Briggs did, all of it, laid it out like a legal document. Dates, amounts, how long it had been going on. He told them Walt Pearson had the records to back it up and that he'd spoken to the sheriff. And then... Thomas stopped. What? Eleanor said. Then he talked about you, Thomas said. He said... He paused, like he was making sure he got it right. He said, this woman walked 14 miles to come to my ranch, and the first thing I did was try to send her away. I was wrong about that. Whatever this town has heard about Eleanor Whitmore, I am here to tell you the opposite. She is the most capable and honest person I have had on this ranch in the 10 years I've owned it, and I would trust her with my life. Eleanor stood at the stove very still. He said that? She said. In front of every person in that room, Thomas said. Eleanor turned back to the stove. She stirred something that didn't need stirring. She did not say anything for a long moment. Good, she said finally. That's good. Thomas watched her with a quiet, knowing expression that she chose not to acknowledge. The second source was Walt Pearson, who came out to the ranch himself the following morning, which he had never done in all his years of supplying it. He came to the kitchen door with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that was equal parts relief and something that might have been shame, though of the productive kind, the kind that had been turned into intention. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I wanted to come myself, to tell you I spoke up at the meeting after Nathan. I told them what I knew, what I'd been keeping in that ledger. He looked at his hat. I should have said something years ago. I knew that then. I know it better now. You said it when it counted, Eleanor said. Come in and have some coffee. He came in and had coffee, and they talked for an hour, and by the time he left, there was an arrangement in place for Eleanor to have direct access to all supply orders going forward, with copies kept both at the ranch and at Pearson's store, reviewed monthly. It was a small thing, practical, unglamorous. It was also the kind of thing that would prevent what happened here from happening again. And Eleanor had always believed that the unglamorous preventions were more important than the dramatic rescues. The third source was the one she hadn't expected. 2 days after the town meeting, a woman came to the ranch house door. Her name was Clara Marsh. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, practical and sharp-looking, with the particular energy of someone who has made up her mind about something and is following through before the nerve runs out. She was the school teacher in town, it turned out, had been for 15 years. And she had known about Briggs's dealings for longer than she cared to admit. "I didn't know who to tell," she said, sitting at Eleanor's kitchen table with coffee she hadn't touched. "I noticed the numbers were wrong in the church fund. Briggs managed those too. Did you know that? He volunteered to manage the church accounts 3 years ago, and I went over them one Sunday when he'd left them out, and the numbers—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "The numbers weren't right," Eleanor said. "No," Clara said. "But he was so respected. And I'm just a teacher, a woman. Who was I going to tell?" She looked at Eleanor directly. "I heard what Nathan said about you at the meeting. I heard what Pearson said. And I thought—" She took a breath. "I thought, here is a woman who saw the same thing I saw and did something about it. And I wanted to meet her." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. "What's the name of the minister who oversees those accounts?" she said. Clara blinked. "Reverend Cole. Why?" "Because those numbers need to be looked at too," Eleanor said. "And you're going to be the one who asks to look at them, because you're the one who already knows where the problem is. I'll help you put together what you need." Clara stared at her. "Just like that?" "Just like that," Eleanor said. "You've been sitting on this for 3 years because you thought no one would listen to you. Clara, someone is listening to you now. Let's not waste it." Clara came back the next day with her own notes, careful and precise, a schoolteacher's handwriting in neat columns. They sat at the kitchen table together for 2 hours, and by the time they were done, there was a clear picture of what Briggs had been doing to the church fund as well. Smaller amounts, but consistent, and going back nearly 4 years. Reverend Cole was not happy, but Reverend Cole was honest, and when Nathan went with Eleanor's compiled documentation and Clara's records to the minister's house the following week, the Reverend spent a long time looking at the papers and then looked up and said, "Lord, forgive me for being blind so long." The sheriff took the case seriously. He had been friendly with Briggs, as Nathan had said, but he was also a man with 30 years in law enforcement and enough professional pride that he wasn't going to let personal friendliness blind him to a documented case of fraud. He reviewed everything, interviewed Pearson, interviewed Clara, reviewed the church records, and within 3 weeks had ridden out to the town Briggs had gone to and served papers. Eleanor was at the kitchen table when Nathan came back from the sheriff's office and told her. She nodded once. "Good," she said. "That's all you're going to say?" he said. "What else is there?" she said. "The law is doing its job. That's what it's supposed to do." Nathan sat down across from her. He had the look he'd been getting more often lately. Something quieter than his usual expression, something that had come to occupy his face in the evenings when the work was done and there was no immediate problem to solve. A look that was almost at rest. It was a different look than he'd had when she arrived. She had noticed the change and not said anything about it. "The east pasture," he said. "The one I sold off 3 years ago. I've been looking at whether there's a way to buy it back." "Is there?" she said. "If the finances recover the way I think they might with the supply costs corrected." He stopped, laid his hands flat on the table. "The amount Briggs was taking, Eleanor, over 8 years. It was enough to have bought that pasture back twice. More than that. It's enough to have expanded the north herd significantly." He shook his head slowly. "Do you know how many times I told myself we just weren't growing fast enough? That I wasn't working hard enough? That something was wrong with my judgment? And none of it was true," she said. "None of it," he said. "Your judgment brought you this far," she said. "Built this ranch from nothing. Your judgment also let you give me the week when your first instinct was no. Your judgment's fine, Nathan. It was just operating on false information." He looked at her. "You're very easy to talk to," he said. It came out like something that surprised him slightly. "James used to say I thought better out loud than anyone he'd ever known," she said. "I think what he meant was that I made it easy for other people to think out loud. Which isn't quite the same thing, but close enough." "James was your husband?" "Yes." "You miss him?" Nathan said, not a question. Not the way I used to, she said honestly. In the beginning it was all grief. Now it's more like absence. Like a chair that used to be filled and isn't anymore. You don't stop seeing the chair, but you learn to walk around it. Nathan was quiet. My wife died 11 years ago, he said. Fever. Very fast. Eleanor looked at him. He had never said this before, not directly. She had known there was no wife. The ranch had the particular quality of a place managed by a man alone, a quality she recognized, but he had never spoken of it. I'm sorry, she said. I built most of this after, he said. I think I built all of it to have something to do, to have somewhere to put the... He stopped. I don't know the right word for what you do with grief when you're not a man who talks about it. Energy, Eleanor said quietly. You put it into work. A lot of people do. Is that what you did? She thought about the years after James, the hotel kitchen, the 14-mile walk, the notebook. Yes, she said, though I also talked to him, in empty rooms, which probably sounds strange. It doesn't, Nathan said. I talked to Margaret for about 2 years after she died, mostly when I was out on the north pasture alone. He paused. I stopped when it started feeling more like keeping her there than letting her go. The kitchen was very quiet, not uncomfortably, just quiet in the way that certain rooms get when two people have said something real and are letting it settle. Nathan, Eleanor said, can I ask you something? Yes. When you stood up at the town meeting, what you said about me. She looked at him directly. Did you mean it? All of it? He looked back at her with the direct, undeflecting gaze of a man who had learned the value of honesty the hard way. Every word, he said. She nodded. She picked up her coffee cup. She turned to look at the window, where the late afternoon light was coming in at the particular angle that meant the day was tipping toward evening. Then thank you, she said. That mattered to me. Good, he said. I wanted it to. The town took time. This was the honest truth of it. The part that wasn't clean or quick or comfortable. People who had believed Briggs did not immediately stop believing him, simply because Nathan Caldwell had stood up at a meeting and said something different. Belief didn't work that way, especially not when the thing a person had to disbelieve was their own long-standing confidence in someone they'd trusted. Eleanor went to town for the first time 2 weeks after Briggs left. She went to Pearson's store to go over the next month's supply order, and she walked in through the front door the way she walked into every room, with her chin level and her pace steady and her understanding of herself intact, and she felt the shift in temperature immediately. There were 4 women in the store. 3 of them looked at her and then looked away in the particular way that communicated awareness without acknowledgement. The 4th one, a woman about Eleanor's age, stout and practical, with a basket on her arm and a direct kind of face, looked at her straight on. You're the one from the Caldwell Ranch, the woman said. I am, Eleanor said. Eleanor Whitmore. Yes. The woman looked her over, not unkindly, but thoroughly. My name is Ruth Carey, the woman said. My husband runs the grain operation south of town. I've known Nathan Caldwell for 12 years. She paused. I've known Samuel Briggs for the same amount of time. Eleanor waited. My husband said the numbers Nathan presented at the meeting were solid, Ruth said. He said he'd checked them against his own records of dealing with Briggs and they lined up. She paused again. My husband is not a man who says things he doesn't mean. I respect that quality, Eleanor said. Ruth looked at her for another moment. We'll see, Ruth said finally. But it didn't have hostility in it. It had the considered quality of a woman who had decided to keep the door open. It was enough. Eleanor went to the counter and went over the supply order with Walt Pearson, who was noticeably more straightforward with her this time. Almost grateful, she thought, to be doing it properly. As she was leaving, Ruth Carey fell into step beside her briefly on the boardwalk outside. Thursday evenings, Ruth said, not looking at her. Some of the women in town get together at my house, quilting, talking, whatever needs doing. She glanced sideways. You'd be welcome. Eleanor looked at her. I'll be there, she said. Ruth nodded once and walked in the opposite direction. Eleanor stood on the boardwalk for a moment, feeling the weight of something she hadn't had in a long time, the specific warmth of a door held open. Then she walked to where the supply wagon was waiting and drove back to Silver Creek Ranch. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Eleanor found unexpectedly stabilizing. The ranch work moved forward, the finances reorganizing slowly but visibly, the supply costs dropping to what they should have been all along, Nathan's face losing some of the tightness it had worn since she'd arrived. Hector came around, as Thomas had predicted, and brought Davies with him. New hands were hired to replace the ones who'd left, and the bunkhouse felt more settled, less like a place waiting for something to go wrong. Eleanor cooked. She organized. She sat with Nathan in the evenings sometimes and helped him go over the financial records, and she taught him the system she had developed, her columns, her cross-referencing, her method of tracking supplies so that the gaps became immediately visible. "You should have been an accountant," Nathan said one evening, watching her work. "Women don't become accountants," she said, without looking up. "They should," he said quietly. She looked up then. I was watching her with an expression she had been trying not to think too carefully about. She looked back down at the numbers. "They will," she said. "Eventually." He didn't say anything to that, but she heard him shift in his chair in a way that sounded like agreement. Thursday evenings, she went to Ruth Carey's house. The first time, there were 7 women, and the conversation was careful. The way conversations are careful when someone new is being evaluated without anyone wanting to admit that's what's happening. Eleanor didn't try to manage it. She sat where she was put, worked on the section of quilt she was given, and answered questions honestly when they were asked. The questions were asked. Some of them were about Briggs. Some were about the ranch. One woman, younger, with quick eyes and a worried mouth, asked very directly, "Is it true you walked 14 miles to get there?" 13 and a half, Eleanor said. "The last half mile I caught a ride on a hay wagon." The young woman stared at her. "Why?" "Because I needed the work," Eleanor said. "And because I had learned that if I waited for things to come to me, I was going to be waiting for a very long time." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Ruth Carey, without looking up from her quilting, said, "That's sense." Nobody argued with it. By the 3rd Thursday, Eleanor was arriving to find a chair already set out for her. By the 5th, the young woman with the worried mouth. Her name was Alice Dunmore, and her husband had recently left her with 2 acres and a mortgage, had come to Eleanor privately before the meeting, and asked if Eleanor might help her understand the lease documents she'd been given by the man trying to buy her land. They sat at Ruth Carey's kitchen table for an hour before the other women arrived. Eleanor went through the document line by line. 3 clauses were predatory. 1 outright misrepresented the terms. Alice's face went through several things as Eleanor explained them. Fear first, then a kind of white-lipped fury, then something that was beginning to look like clarity. "What do I do?" Alice said. "You don't sign it," Eleanor said. "And then you come talk to me and we figure out what your actual options are. But first, you don't sign anything you don't fully understand. That's the rule." "I didn't know I had that choice," Alice said. Eleanor looked at her. "You always had that choice," she said. "You just didn't know it yet." Alice did not sign the document. 2 weeks later, she had a different arrangement, a fair one, negotiated with Eleanor's help and Ruth Carey's husband's legal connections. The 2 acres stayed hers. Word traveled the way. Word traveled in small towns, faster than it should, and slightly changed in the telling, but the core of it intact. There was a woman at the Caldwell Ranch who understood numbers, who could read documents, who would sit down with you and help you understand what you were looking at. Women started coming, not many at first. 1s and 2s, in the hours when Eleanor could spare time from the ranch work, sitting at the kitchen table with their household accounts, or their lease papers, or their supply records, asking questions they had never felt they had anyone to ask. Eleanor answered every one. Nathan noticed. He said nothing for a while, just observed the steady increase of visitors to the kitchen with the thoughtful silence of a man trying to understand something that surprised him. One evening he said, "You've helped 6 women in the last month." 7, Eleanor said. Martha Hollis came Tuesday. Martha Hollis, Nathan said. Her husband left her with $400 of debt she didn't know about. She knows about it now, Eleanor said, and we have a plan for addressing it. Nathan sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Eleanor across it with that expression she had been trying not to think too carefully about. I owe you an apology, he said. She looked up. When you walked in my door, he said, I looked at you and I thought I could see exactly what you were worth, what you could do. He paused. I was so wrong it embarrasses me. Eleanor held his gaze. You gave me the week, she said. You always get credit for that. That's not enough credit for what I almost didn't do, he said. Maybe not, she said. But it's where the story really started, so I'm keeping it. Something crossed his face, slow and warm and honest. Eleanor, he said. Nathan, she said. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the evening sounds of the ranch moved through the walls like they always did. Horses, wind, the distant voices of the hands from the bunkhouse, the ordinary music of a working place, doing what it was built to do. The east pasture, Nathan said. I've made an offer to buy it back. The owner accepted this morning. Eleanor was still. She stopped. That's very good news. It is, he said. I also spoke to a lawyer in Wichita about formalizing the supply management arrangement we've been running. He said what you've set up is more comprehensive than most commercial operations he's seen. It's just organized, she said. Eleanor, he said patiently, there is no just in front of what you do. I need you to stop putting just in front of it. She looked at him. He looked back. The lamp between them was burning steady, throwing its warm light across the account books and the supply ledger and the plain face of Eleanor's notebook. And in the quiet of that kitchen, something was sitting between them that had been building for weeks. Something neither of them had named yet, because neither of them had been sure what to do with the naming. Nathan said, I would like to take you to dinner in town, on Saturday. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. People will talk, she said. People are already talking, he said. I would like them to have accurate information. She looked at him. Are you sure about that? She said carefully. What they'll say about a man like you and a woman. She didn't finish it. She didn't have to. A woman like you, Nathan said, and his voice was level and unambiguous, is exactly what I said at the town meeting. The most capable and honest person on this ranch. The person I trust with my life. He held her gaze. I am very sure, Eleanor. She felt something in her chest release, slow and warm and unguarded, the particular sensation of a thing that has been held tightly for a long time, finally being allowed to rest. Saturday, she said. Saturday, he said. He stood up. He put on his hat. He said, very quietly, thank you, for not giving up on this place, or on me. She looked up at him. Thank you, she said, for giving me the week. He walked out. Eleanor sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, and she thought about James, and about grief, and about the chairs that stay empty, and the doors that sometimes open when you've stopped expecting them to. She thought about the 14 miles she had walked in cracked boots. She thought about Samuel Briggs's smile, and Nathan's first cool appraisal, and the supply ledger that had been sitting on that shelf, waiting for someone with eyes trained to see it. She thought about Alice Dunmore, and Ruth Carey, and Clara Marsh, and all the women who had sat at this kitchen table, and let her help them understand what they were looking at. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere with nothing, and discover that nothing had never been the truth of it. She reached across the table and opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote the date. Beneath it she wrote, East pasture secured. Supply system formalized. Saturday dinner, town. She looked at the words. Then she added, in smaller letters at the bottom of the page, 7 women helped this month. More coming. She closed the notebook. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed and slept the solid, untroubled sleep of a woman who knew, for the first time in a long time, exactly where she was and exactly what she was worth. Saturday came with the kind of clear Kansas sky that looked like someone had stretched blue cloth from one end of the world to the other and pulled it tight. Eleanor stood in the small room off the kitchen and looked at the two dresses she owned and made a practical decision about which one said what she needed it to say. She chose the better one. Dark green wool, worn but clean, with buttons that still sat straight. And she pinned her good brooch at the collar and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked like what she was. A woman of 38, wide and solid, with work-roughened hands and a face that had seen things. She did not look like the kind of woman men took to dinner in town. She knew that. She also knew that Nathan Caldwell had asked her, specifically and clearly, and meant it. So she put on her coat and she went. Nathan was waiting by the wagon in the yard, dressed in his good clothes, hat brushed clean, and when he saw her come out of the kitchen door, he straightened in the way that men straighten when they are trying not to show that something has moved them. He helped her up into the wagon without making a production of it. Just offered his hand, steadily, and she took it. And they drove into town in the late afternoon light, with the easy quiet of two people who had learned how to be in a room together. The restaurant was called Mercer's, and it was the only proper sit-down eating establishment in town, which meant that when Nathan Caldwell walked through the door with Eleanor Whitmore, approximately everyone inside saw it happen. Eleanor felt the shift in temperature the moment they crossed the threshold. She kept her chin level. Nathan put his hand briefly at the small of her back as they moved toward a table. Just a light touch, a gesture of presence. And she felt that land too, felt it in the particular way that small deliberate gestures land when they are made by someone who understands exactly what they mean. The room did not stop. People did not stare openly. But the awareness moved through it the way awareness moved through small rooms. A slight shift in conversation. A glance redirected. The specific quality of a social space adjusting to new information. Ruth Carey was at a table near the window with her husband. Ruth looked at Eleanor, then at Nathan, then back at Eleanor. She gave a single, contained nod that communicated more than most people's full sentences. Eleanor nodded back. They ordered. They ate. They talked about the East Pasture and the supply system, and Thomas Reed, who Nathan was thinking about promoting to the position Briggs had vacated, a real promotion, with real authority and real wages, because he had earned it honestly, and Nathan was not going to make the mistake of leaving a good man without recognition again. "He'll do well," Eleanor said. "I know," Nathan said. "He told me something last week. He said he stayed on this ranch through the Briggs years because he kept believing it would come right eventually. He said he stopped believing that about a month before you arrived." Eleanor looked at him. "And now?" "He said he's got no plans to leave," Nathan said. His words were... He paused, and something that was definitely a smile moved across his face this time, all the way. He said, "The biscuits are too good to go anywhere." Eleanor laughed. It came out fully, the real kind, and Nathan's smile widened at the sound of it, and at the table near the window. Ruth Carey looked over once more, and this time allowed herself something that was almost a smile too. On the drive back, the sky had gone the deep blue-black of a Kansas evening, and the stars were coming out in the particular generous way they did out here, where there was enough dark and enough space for them to mean something. Nathan drove and Eleanor sat beside him, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't require filling. After a while, Nathan said, "Tell me something." "What?" "When you walked up to my door that first morning, with your suitcase, and I looked at you the way I did." He paused. "What did you think?" Eleanor considered the question honestly. "I thought," she said slowly, "that you were going to be the same as every other door I'd knocked on. And I thought I was going to have to decide whether that was going to stop me." She paused. "And then I thought, no, it isn't." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad it didn't," he said. "So am I," she said. He looked at her sideways in the dark, and she looked back, and the wagon moved through the Kansas night toward Silver Creek Ranch, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed to be said just yet. The following weeks carried their own momentum. The East Pasture purchase was finalized on a Tuesday morning, and Nathan came into the kitchen with the signed papers in his hand, and set them on the table in front of Eleanor with an expression that was as close to uncomplicated happiness as she had seen on him. "It's done," he said. She looked at the papers, looked at him. "How does it feel?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about most things. "Like getting something back I didn't know I still wanted," he said, "until I had it again." Eleanor understood that feeling. She understood it in a way that went beyond the East pasture. Thomas Reed's promotion was announced to the hands on a Wednesday, and the reaction was what Eleanor had expected from the men she had come to know. Straightforward and genuine. Hector shook Thomas's hand and meant it. Davies said, "About time." Even the newer hands, who hadn't lived through the Briggs years, understood from the way the older ones responded that this was something good and overdue. Thomas himself came to the kitchen afterward, with the slightly stunned expression of a young man who had been told something he had wanted to believe and wasn't sure yet if he was allowed. "You had something to do with this," he said to Eleanor. "Nathan made the decision," she said. "Eleanor." She looked at him. "Thank you," Thomas said simply. And his voice had the particular directness of someone who was not going to be talked out of what they knew to be true. "You earned it," she said. "I just made sure the right person was paying attention." He nodded once and went back out to work. She stood at the stove and thought about what it meant to be someone who made sure the right person was paying attention. She had been doing it her whole life, pointing, quietly and carefully, at the things that were being missed. At the hotel, in her own household, at every kitchen table where she had sat with a woman who didn't know what she was looking at. She had spent most of that life doing it without anyone noticing that she was the one doing it. Nathan noticed. He noticed in the small, consistent way of a man who had retrained himself to pay attention, which was more meaningful to Eleanor than any grand declaration, because grand declarations were easy and small, consistent noticing was hard. He noticed when she reorganized the storage system for the third time to account for seasonal supply changes, and he asked her why before he approved the change, which meant he was learning to understand the system rather than just trusting her management of it. He noticed when she came back from Ruth Carey's Thursday evening and was quieter than usual, and he didn't push, just made sure the lamp in the sitting room was lit and left a cup of tea on the table. She noticed things too. She noticed that he ate better now, with real appetite, the kind that had probably been absent for years before someone started putting food worth eating in front of him. She noticed that he was sleeping more. The deep lines around his eyes had softened slightly. She noticed that he talked to the hands differently now, with less of the reserve that came from a man protecting himself against betrayal, and more of the natural authority of someone who no longer needed to hold everyone at arm's length. She noticed that he looked for her when he came in from the yard. Not obviously, not in a way that would have been visible to someone who wasn't paying attention. But she was always paying attention, and she saw the small automatic movement of his eyes toward the kitchen, or the sitting room, or wherever she was likely to be. Just a check, just a confirming of presence. And she felt the warmth of it move through her quietly every time. Clara Marsh came back to the ranch on a Tuesday in November. The church fund situation had been fully documented and turned over to Reverend Cole, who had addressed it with the quiet severity of a man who took the concept of sacred trust seriously. The money was not fully recoverable. Some of it had been spent in ways that couldn't be undone, but enough had been traced and returned to matter. Clara came to thank Eleanor, but she also came with something else. "I've been thinking," she said, sitting at the kitchen table with the particular energy of someone who has thought about something long enough that it has become a plan. "About what you've been doing here, with the women who come to you." "What about it?" Eleanor said. "You've helped 12 women in the last 6 weeks, Clara said. "Alice Dunmore, Martha Hollis, 3 women from the south end of the county I only heard about secondhand. More I probably don't know about." "It's just," Eleanor started. "Don't say just," Clara said, with an authority that reminded Eleanor she was a schoolteacher. "It's not just anything. You have a skill, a real one, and these women are coming to you because there is nowhere else for them to go, and because word has gotten out that you will actually help them understand what they're looking at without making them feel stupid for not knowing already." Eleanor was quiet. "What are you suggesting?" she said. Clara leaned forward. "I'm suggesting that what you're doing at this kitchen table in your spare hours could be something more. Something structured. A regular meeting. Women who need to understand finances, contracts, household accounts. You teach it. I help organize it. We use the schoolhouse." Eleanor looked at her. The idea landed with a particular weight. Not heavy in the bad way, but heavy in the way of something that had mass and dimension and was therefore real. "I'm a cook," she said. "You're a great many things," Clara said evenly. "Cook is one of them. The smallest one, in my estimation." Eleanor sat with it. "I'd have to talk to Nathan," she said finally. "About the time. The ranch still—" "Talk to Nathan," Clara said. She did. That evening, in the sitting room, with the account books put away and the lamp burning low, she told him what Clara had proposed. He listened without interrupting, which was something she had come to appreciate about him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How many women have come to you?" he said. "Clara says 12 in 6 weeks. I hadn't counted." "I had," he said. She looked at him. "I counted," he said. "Because I noticed, and because I've been watching what happens when they leave. The ones who came in looking frightened. They don't leave that way." He paused. "Eleanor, what Clara is describing, that's important work. More important than the ranch's supply schedule." "The ranch? Thomas can manage the supply schedule," he said. "He's been learning it for weeks. You trained him." He held her gaze. "This is what you're supposed to be doing. Not instead of the kitchen, but alongside it. Because you can do both, and you know it." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "You're sure?" she said. "I've rarely been more sure of anything," he said. The first formal meeting of what Clara called, in the notice she posted at the church and the general store, the Silver Creek Women's Cooperative, was held on a Thursday evening in the schoolhouse with 11 women in attendance. Eleanor stood at the front of that room and looked out at 11 faces, some nervous, some determined, some wearing the careful blankness of people who have learned not to show too much of what they need. And she thought about the kitchen table at the Granger Hotel, where she had first learned that numbers could tell you the truth when people wouldn't. She thought about James. She thought about 14 miles and cracked boots and a supply ledger hidden behind a stack of tin plates. She thought about what it meant to arrive with everything you needed in a world that couldn't see it yet. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore," she said. "I'm the cook at Silver Creek Ranch. I'm not a teacher, and I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a banker. What I am is someone who has spent 20 years learning how to read the numbers that govern people's lives. And I am here because every one of you deserves to understand those numbers too. Whatever brought you here tonight, fear, confusion, a document you couldn't make sense of, a feeling that something wasn't right. I want you to know that you were right to follow that feeling. And we're going to start from the beginning and make sure that feeling never leaves you without an answer again." The room was very quiet. Then Alice Dunmore, sitting in the front row, said, "Can you start with what to look for in a lease document? Because I almost signed something terrible and I didn't even know." "That's exactly where we'll start," Eleanor said. They were there for 2 hours. When it was over and the women had gone, Clara stayed to put the chairs back and found Eleanor standing at the front of the empty room with a particular look on her face. "Well," Clara said. Eleanor looked around the room. "We're going to need more chairs next week," she said. Clara smiled. "I thought so." They did need more chairs. The second meeting had 16 women. The third had 22. By the fourth week, Ruth Carey had organized a small committee to handle the practical logistics. Who brought what? Who kept notes? How the questions from one week would be addressed in the next. And the whole thing had taken on a life that surprised Eleanor by how natural it felt. How right. She was standing outside the schoolhouse after the fifth meeting, in the cold November air, when Nathan's wagon came down the road. He had taken to driving her to and from the meetings, which was not strictly necessary, but which she had stopped objecting to because she had recognized it for what it was. Not management, not chivalry in the old-fashioned controlling sense, but the simple preference of a man who wanted to be where she was. She understood that preference because she had the same one in the opposite direction. He helped her up into the wagon, and they pulled away from the schoolhouse, and he said, "How was it tonight?" 22 women, she said. Martha Hollis brought her daughter. Her daughter is 17. She sat in the back and listened to the whole thing without saying a word, and at the end, she came up to me and asked if she could come back next week. Nathan drove in silence for a moment. You know what you've built, he said. It was not a question. I know what we've built, she said. Clara, Ruth, the women who keep coming back. You started it, he said. A kitchen table started it, she said. And a supply ledger. And a crooked ranch manager who thought I was too insignificant to pay attention to. Nathan was quiet for a moment. I think about that sometimes, he said. Briggs. What he was certain of when you walked in. What he was certain you weren't. So do I, she said. Does it make you angry? He said. She thought about it honestly. It used to, she said. Now it mostly just reminds me that the most important things in any situation are almost always the things the people in power don't think are worth watching. Nathan turned the wagon through the gate of Silver Creek Ranch. The house was lit from inside, warm and solid in the dark, and the yard was quiet with the particular peace of a working place at rest. He stopped the wagon, and they sat for a moment in the easy silence that had become one of her favorite things. Then Nathan said, Eleanor. Nathan. He turned to look at her. In the dim light from the house, she could see the steadiness in his face, the particular quality of a man who has thought carefully about what he is about to say, and has decided to say it anyway. I want to ask you something, he said. And I want you to know that however you answer it, nothing changes. The cooperative, your work with the women, your place at this ranch. None of that is contingent on what you say. I need you to know that before I ask. Eleanor looked at him. Her heart was doing something steady and unavoidable in her chest. Ask, she said. I would like you to stay here, he said. Not as the cook, not as the woman who manages the supply system. As my wife, if you're willing, if that is something you want. He paused. I am asking because I love you. I have been trying to find the right time to say that for several weeks, and I have concluded there is no right time, and I should simply say it. The Kansas night was very still. Eleanor looked at Nathan Caldwell, this large, tired, honest man who had almost sent her away, who had stood up at a town meeting and called her the most capable and honest person he'd known, who counted the women who came to her kitchen and left a lamp lit in the sitting room and drove her to meetings in the dark because he wanted to be where she was. She thought about all the things she had believed she would never have again. She thought about empty chairs and open doors. She thought about what it meant to be seen. Yes, she said. I'm willing, and it is something I want. Nathan looked at her. Something moved through his face, deep and unguarded and real, the expression of a man who has been carrying something carefully for a long time and has finally been able to set it down in safe hands. He took her hand. She let him. They sat like that in the quiet yard of Silver Creek Ranch, while the stars did what Kansas stars did, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else, because everything that needed to be said had been said. They were married in December, at the church in town, on a Saturday morning with hard bright winter light coming through the windows, and Ruth Carey sitting in the front row with her husband, and Clara Marsh beside her, and Thomas Reed standing up with Nathan, because there was no one Nathan trusted more. There were more people in that church than Eleanor had expected. Women from the cooperative. Ranch hands, scrubbed and uncomfortable in good clothes. Walt Pearson, in the back, looking like a man who had earned the right to be there by telling the truth when it cost him something. Alice Dunmore was there with her daughter, the 17-year-old who had sat in the back of the schoolhouse and asked to come back next week. Eleanor looked at her across the church, and the girl looked back with eyes that were steady and clear, and had something in them that had not been there the first time Eleanor had seen her. It took Eleanor a moment to identify it. Then she did. Possibility. That was what it was. The wedding was simple and honest and real, which was the only kind Eleanor had ever wanted. When Reverend Cole pronounced them married, and Nathan looked at her with that expression that had been building for months and finally had nowhere left to hide, Eleanor Whitmore, Eleanor Caldwell now, stood in the clear winter light and felt something she had not felt in so long, that she had almost forgotten the word for it. Whole. That was the word. The months that followed were what Nathan had called getting something back. Not the past, not what had been before, but something new that had the solidity of something that had been built properly, with good materials and honest labor, and the understanding that anything worth having took real work to keep. The cooperative grew. By spring it had 43 regular members, women from 3 counties, and Clara had organized a lending library of resource materials that sat in 2 crates at the back of the schoolhouse and circulated on a sign-out system that Eleanor had designed. Alice Dunmore's daughter, her name was Bess, started helping with the accounting records. She was 18 now, and she had a mind for numbers that reminded Eleanor of herself at that age. The same instinctive recognition of patterns, the same quiet pleasure in a column that added up correctly. Eleanor taught her everything she knew. One afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table at Silver Creek Ranch with the account books open between them, Bess looked up and said, "How did you learn all this? Who taught you?" Eleanor thought about it. "Necessity," she said. "And a man named James who believed I thought better out loud than anyone he'd ever known." Bess absorbed this. "What happened to him?" "He died," Eleanor said simply. "And I kept going. Because that's what you do with the things people give you. You keep going with them." Bess nodded slowly, like someone storing something important. She looked back at the numbers. She said, "I want to do what you do. Help people understand their own situations. Make sure they know what they're looking at." Eleanor looked at her. "Then do it," she said. "You think I can?" "I know you can," Eleanor said. "The only question is whether you will." Bess looked at her for a moment. Then she looked back at the numbers. "I will," she said. Summer came to Silver Creek Ranch with the full weight of a Kansas summer. Heat that meant business, sky that went on forever, the specific beauty of a land that didn't apologize for what it was. Eleanor stood one evening at the edge of the east pasture, the one Nathan had bought back, the one that felt like recovering something, and looked out across the grass and the light and the distance, and Nathan came and stood beside her, and they were quiet together, the way they had learned to be quiet together, which was one of the best things about them, she thought. Their quiet fit. "Tell me something," Nathan said. "What?" "What do you think about when you stand here?" Eleanor considered. "I think about the walk," she said. "The 14 miles, the crack in my boot, the way I knocked on your door." She paused. "I think about how certain I was that you were going to be another door that didn't open, and how I decided it didn't matter, because I was going to knock anyway." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad you knocked," he said. "So am I," she said. He put his arm around her. Not a small, careful gesture this time, but the full and natural weight of a man who had learned to stop being careful about showing what mattered to him. And she leaned into it. The full and natural weight of a woman who had learned that being seen was not a thing to be afraid of. The prairie moved in the evening wind. The east pasture spread out before them, green and real, something recovered, something new. 43 women met in the schoolhouse every Thursday and learned to read the numbers that governed their lives. Thomas Reed managed the supply chain with the precision of someone who had been taught well and taken the teaching seriously. Bess Dunmore sat at a kitchen table and learned to see the patterns that told the truth. And Eleanor Caldwell, who had walked 14 miles in cracked boots to knock on a door she wasn't sure would open, stood in the evening light of a Kansas summer with her hand in her husband's hand and understood, with the full, clear certainty of a woman who had earned the right to know it, that she had never arrived at Silver Creek Ranch with nothing. She had arrived with everything. It had simply taken the right place, the right people, and the courage to stay long enough for the world to finally see it. And now the world saw it, and it would never unsee